convention coverage.
Concluding this evening, beginning at 7.
You're viewing Iowa Public Television, a resource for Iowa's future.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television, with funding for the Iowa broadcast provided by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour.
Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff.
And I'm Charlayne HUNTER-GAULT. We're both in Houston for the final night of the Republican convention.
After the news summary, we focus on the task ahead for both halves of the Republican ticket. First, the president's speech, as seen by campaign official Mary MATALIN and 4 others. Then, Vice President Quayle, as seen by his home state delegation. And finally, a conversation with Marilyn Quayle about the campaign, past, present, and future.
Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour is provided by AT&T and by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
The lead off here. George Bush goes from the bench to the batter's box tonight looking for a political long ball. The one-time Yale first baseman and now 41st president will tell the American people why he should remain in the post for another 4 years. Mr. Bush is sure to be a hit with the thousands of Republican faithful here in Houston when he accepts their party's nomination later this evening. But the crowd that counts most will be watching at home and will register its score in November. Mr. Bush visited the Astrodome early this morning, where he practiced at the speaker's podium. He told reporters that he was up for the challenge.
Great similarity between politics and competitive athletics, or a political speech like this. Adrenaline factor, I call it. It's very, very true, and for those that have done both, I know you know what I'm talking about. It's similar. I'll be there.
Anything new in it?
New ideas?
Yes.
A lot of ideas that we want that haven't been tried.
Like
That's
what?
New. Make them new.
When asked if he would propose a tax cut this evening, Mr. Bush thumbed through his speech and joked it must be in here somewhere. His campaign aides also downplayed speculation of a major announcement to resuscitate the economy. This on a day when the government reported that first-time jobless claims in early August posted their biggest weekly rise in 10 years. Judy?
Governor Bill Clinton said today, no matter how good the president's speech is tonight, it wouldn't make up for a track record of domestic failures. He spoke to reporters as he left Little Rock on a campaign trip.
I expect him to give a very good speech, but he gave the speech of his life 4 years ago when they said he had to give it, and he gave the speech of his life 4 years ago in which he promised 15 million new jobs, no new taxes, an environmental presidency, an education presidency. It was a wonderful speech. But now we no longer have to read his lips, we can read his record. And so I think it'll be a very good speech, but it can't change the facts and the difference between what he's done and what he said he'd do 4 years ago.
Clinton and Senator Al Gore will embark on another of their bus tours tomorrow. The 3-day trip will start in Detroit, then make stops in Ohio and Pennsylvania before winding up in Buffalo on Sunday.
14,000 people were ordered to evacuate their homes in Central California today because of a raging fire. The blaze has destroyed 53 buildings, including 37 homes in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Firefighters have been hampered by rough terrain and 100-degree temperatures. Nearly 1,000 residents near a chemical plant in Odessa, Texas, were forced to temporarily leave their homes today. Early this morning, lightning struck a storage tank at the Champion chemical plant, setting off a series of explosions. The ensuing fire released toxic fumes that caused some minor injuries.
Iraq today categorically rejected the Allied plan to create a safe haven for the Shiite population in the south. The U.S., Britain, and France will soon declare a no-fly zone below the 32nd parallel. Iraqi aircraft flying in it would be attacked. The zone is similar to one now in place in the north protecting the Kurds. A spokesman for Saddam Hussein said, quote, "Iraqi people in the north, center, and south stand united behind the national patriotic leadership and refuse imperialist Zionist schemes to divide the country." Relief flights to the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo resumed today after a 2-day suspension. But later this evening, the city was rocked by some of the heaviest shelling in a month. The main hospital was hit, and the Parliament building was reported to be burning. Earlier in the day, a United Nations peacekeeper was killed by sniper fire. The Ukrainian soldier was the second peacekeeper killed in Bosnia.
Amnesty International today said Haiti had returned to the brutal repression of the Duvalier dictatorship, with arbitrary arrest, torture, and murder as standard government policy. The human rights group accused the Bush administration of violating international law by forcing Haitian refugees to return to the country. Nearly 40,000 have fled since democratically elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide was overthrown last year. From 1957 until 1986, Haiti was ruled with an iron hand by Francois Papadoc Duvalier and his son Jean-Claude.
That's our summary of today's news. Now it's on to the President's make or break speech, the Vice President's home state boosters, and a conversation with Marilyn Quayle.
It's all but over here at the Republican National Convention in Houston, all but what GOP officials are calling the night of the Big Bang and hopefully the Big Bounce. Within hours, President Bush, still trailing in the polls, will stand at the podium of the Houston Astrodome to give what some are calling the speech of his political lifetime. What is the mood of the campaign as the GOP enters this final stretch, and where do they go from here? We asked the woman who plans the strategy of this campaign, Deputy Campaign Manager Mary Matalin. Ms. Matalin, thank you for joining us on this very busy final day of the convention. You've reached the end of the trail. How satisfied are you with what's happened here this week?
We are most satisfied. We are ecstatic, as a matter of fact. Everything we set out to do, we believe we've accomplished, and we're waiting for the final chapter tonight is the campaign kickoff, and we think we've done exactly what we needed to do.
What do you think you needed to do? I mean, in a nutshell.
Well, coming into the convention, we certainly had to unite the Republican Party, who had been in a little bit of disparate factions throughout the primary and also had been frustrated like the rest of America. And we think through our platform deliberations and coming together in unity on that platform, we put what divides us behind us and what unites us in front of us. So that was point one. We think, secondly, we need to galvanize those forces once they united, and we think we did that on the first night with President Reagan's speech, and we need to further refine what has been done through the entire convention with the President's speech tonight, and that is to set out his agenda, how he sees the country today and where he wants to take the country and how he wants to take it there in the next 4 years.
I want to get into some of the specifics of that in a minute, get you to tell us everything he's going to say, even including the tax cut.
It'll be a short conversation.
But you say you achieved your objectives, and yet with delegates we've interviewed, reading the media, even talking to voters that we've been following throughout the campaign, many of them are saying that they're getting mixed messages out of this convention. Everything from the Pat Buchanan side, which many felt were, his words were exclusionary, even some say mean, to Rich Bond, who talked about, you know, we being America, they not, to President Reagan and Mrs. Bush, who were very inclusionary. I mean, do you see the same mixed messages that these people are complaining about and saying is not helpful to the party?
No, I don't see mixed messages. I see a growing party. There, for a long time, we were a minority party, and it was easy to have one message and one voice, but we are a growing party. We have party parity with the Democrats. We have lots of opinions and lots of room for lots of opinions, and I think you saw the diversity of the membership of the Republican Party this week.
But how do you get a single message out of a Buchanan speech, which even some of his delegates told us bothered them, and the Reagan-Bush, Barbara Bush speech on the other hand? I mean, what is the single unifying theme?
The single unifying theme is everyone agrees that they want to re-elect George Bush, and what George Bush wants to do with the country and where he wants to go in the next 4 years, and the principles that his programs are predicated on are vastly and fundamentally different from Democratic principles. So whatever their quarrel is with the various factions, they agree on the re-election of George Bush.
Clinton today, you probably heard his speech, charged that the convention was pandering to fears. But even some of the moderate Republicans we have been interviewing in the last few days said that they were tired of the negative isms coming out of the campaign, the Democrat bashing, the emphasis on what the other candidates and campaigns are not doing as opposed to the emphasis on what the Republicans are doing. Are they wrong, or do you hear that, and does that resonate in any way with the campaign?
I think two things about that, and yes, I do think they're wrong. I think Little Rock is in a little bit of a meltdown. Their rapid response has turned into overreact. I don't know if everybody else feels like this, but it sounds to me like the governor's been whining all week long. Every time we talk about his record, every time we talk about his agenda, he goes into a full-force whine. And I secondly think that the press, in pulling back on their coverage of the conventions, both conventions, in the case of ours, has tended to focus on our focus on what separates us from the Democratic Party, and less focus on the speeches that have talked about Republican principles and Republican programs.
But as I said, even some of the Republican delegates have told us there's too much negative here, that there needs to be more of what we can do, we the Republicans.
I really don't know what delegates you're talking to. I've been to a lot of conventions, and I've yet to be at one where you could go to the floor and hear a pin drop. So I don't know out of 36,000 people which ones you're pulling out, but certainly the ones that are here that we have to work with when we spin out of here into the general election are all fired up and ready to go to war.
You've taken a lot of heat for attacks on Bill Clinton's personal life and the Republicans generally for negative campaigning. Is that at an end? I mean, and do you regret any of that? Is that going to stop, or?
If I might clarify, since you brought it up, I did not attack Bill Clinton on his personal life. I repeated what his top aide and longtime chief of staff, Betsy Wright, had said to her delegates in New York City and had repeated to the Washington Post.
About the bimbo.
That she had been put in charge of the bimbo patrol. Those are her words, because there had been so many bimbo eruptions. Those are her words. I really did have a judgment breakdown, because I did not ever expect that this having been reported twice in the Washington Post that it would have been reacted to the way that it was. So of course I regret that it distracted from this president's speech that day, which was a very good one. But no, I don't apologize for a nanosecond for defending this president who's been attacked every day, every single day. Have you heard Bill Clinton give one speech or make one comment that hasn't been negative about the president? And many of his campaign aides and named chairmen have disparaged the president in very personal terms. So let's everybody stop this. Let's everybody talk about both candidates' records and both candidates' agendas. He brings it up more than we do.
Is there any plan to get rid of what President Bush himself has called the sleaze aspect of and negativism in the campaigning? I mean, or is the campaign satisfied with the way that it's going? And
I think the campaign is satisfied that it's beginning to be understood that there's a very clear differences between the records and the agendas and the qualifications of these two candidates. And I think the voters, the American voters, need to know those differences. There has not been a sleaze factor. We understand what we're to cover and what we're not to cover, and we have not crossed over that line.
All right, let's turn to the speech tonight. Is this the speech of the president's life, and is it a make or break deal?
I think the press has attached a lot of hyperbole to it. I think the voters out there don't care about the president's performance so much as the substance of what he has to say. They want to know where he wants to take this country, and they also want to know why that is a better route then the Democrats want to take it down. They haven't voted for a Democrat in any of the 5 of the last 6 presidential elections, and that's what they want to hear. They're not looking for the Follies or some big entertainment like they got in New York City. They're looking for George Bush's words. So it's not a performance of a lifetime, but he does have to clearly lay out where he wants to go and clearly lay out why that is different, and of course we believe better than the way they want to go.
Are there any major things that we should be looking for? Any surprises we should be looking for? You have no idea?
I have none.
Why is it that it's taken? I mean, we had reports that the president was still working on his speech as late as today. Why is that?
He's a perfectionist. I think he wants it to be good. He understands that he wants to give a good speech tonight.
But you're not going to tell us if he's going to call for a tax cut or if he's going to reshuffle his cabinet or any new initiative?
No, I'm not. I doubt. If I knew, I wouldn't tell you.
Okay, well, let's don't waste any more time on that. Some say that for all of the president's years in public life that he has no fixed intellectual address, that people don't know what he stands for, and that sometimes he stood for some things and other times he stood for just the opposite. A, do you agree with that characterization, and is that, are we going to hear the address clearly tonight of what he stands for and who he is?
I never understand this argument. Of course I disagree with it. I find him to be firmly grounded in what we believe are Republican principles.
But why don't people understand what you understand? I mean, why is the public and the media and the columnists all saying who is
I think because the focus for the past 3.5 years when people were seeing George Bush in the role of president has been largely focused for good reason on foreign affairs. The entire world has changed in ways we could have never imagined. And 4 years ago, everyone wanted those problems solved. They wanted nuclear proliferation solved. They wanted containment of communists solved. Those large problems, humongous problems of our lifetimes have been solved, and the focus was on them. The focus was on the Berlin Wall falling. So we have seen a side of George Bush, and we have seen him solving problems in the arena where the problems were erupting, and we've seen him display extraordinary leadership and steady experience in the solving of those problems, and we also saw what he can do without his hands tied behind his back in the Democratic Congress.
New York Times says he doesn't accept responsibility for his own actions, that he blames the Congress, he blames everybody else, and tonight he has to do some of that. You probably don't agree with that.
I think the New York Times must be working for Little Rock. I'm not going to respond to the New York Times criteria of the president's campaign or qualifications to be president.
Okay, just very quickly, how much of a bounce are you expecting to get out of this performance tonight?
Well, you'll think this is spin, and your viewers will think this is spin. We're not looking for a big bounce. We think these polls have been all over the place. We can see just by this week that they've been all over the place. We think they will continue to tighten up as we go into the election, and the candidates aren't an even playing field, and they're compared to each other every single day, but we're not looking for anything of a serious nature poll-wise until this campaign is in October. So, and the only poll we really care about is the one on November 3rd.
All right. Well, Mary Madeline, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now we turn to a quartet of political strategists for their views on how the convention's going and what needs to happen tonight. Roger Stone is a senior advisor to the 1988 Bush Quayle campaign. Wendy Sherman is a Democratic consultant in Washington and was an advisor to the Dukakis campaign in 1988. Neil Newhouse is a Republican pollster, and Bob BECKEL is a Democratic analyst who was the national campaign manager for Walter Mondale in 1984. Bob BECKEL, you heard Mary Madeline say she is most satisfied with the way this convention's going. What do you think?
That's what I expected her to say. She's very good at saying what's good for her candidate. I just looked at some poll data that confirms something I suspected, that they are going to get a better bounce out of it. That was a little bit of spin on Mary's part. But they've done that by driving Bill Clinton's positives down. They haven't increased George Bush's positives.
By criticizing
By criticizing, yeah. I mean, the carpet bombing of Bill Clinton this week has taken a toll, and it should after these many nights. What they haven't succeeded in doing, which I think is their fundamental problem, is they have not made George Bush a candidate that is a positive force in a campaign going into the fall. They're going to get a bounce. The problem is it's very tough to sustain negative bounces. And right now, they've done half the job. They've taken on Bill Clinton, but they haven't made the case for George Bush.
Roger Stone, would you agree with that assessment?
Well, George Bush hasn't been on center stage yet. It's premature to make a judgment about how successful the convention has been. What surprises me is that there's been this much movement thus far without the central actor in this drama having a chance to state his case.
The movement, again, being Bill Clinton's negatives
going off, but more importantly, the gap between the two candidates closing to around 11 points. We were looking at almost a 30-point margin right after the Democratic convention. So that is a very significant movement without Bush yet having his say.
Wendy Sherman in Washington, what do you think the Republicans have accomplished so far here?
I think they've accomplished giving the people in this country a sense that they're about hatchet jobs, and actually they've put a lot of women forward as their hatchet women, which is a sort of an unusual role given that the Democrats put women forward in substantive roles about an agenda for the real family values, which is bread and butter on the kitchen table. I think that we've seen a very extremist Republican Party, and I know that they've tried to cast Bill Clinton as extremist and dangerous, but in fact we had Pat Buchanan saying vitriolic things and other people coming into that chorus. And if George Bush is really going to change the cabinet, I wonder if we're going to see Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. I think there's a lot to be concerned about, and I agree with Bob. Only half the job has been done. Roger said the same thing, and the president's got a lot to do tonight.
Neil Newhouse, an extremist Republican Party, is that what the American people have seen?
Not hardly. If anything, they've seen a Republican Party that is made up of different pieces of a mosaic. This campaign, this convention is a process of putting those pieces together. No two groups may necessarily agree on all issues, but it's in any political party, you have divergent factions. What we've seen here is the same thing this week. We came into this convention 25 to 30 points down. If Roger's numbers are right and we end up being 11 points down, that's an incredible gain, an incredible boost. If we're within a handful of points on Labor Day or even October 1st, George Bush can win this election, and he can win it handily. And keep in mind, this is a man, the president, whose approval ratings before this were around 35%. And what this demonstrates, I think, is really the weakness and the softness in Bill Clinton's support.
Bob Beckel, the weakness in Clinton's support?
Well, first of all, Neil should come down here and look at this mosaic. It's all one color, Neil. I don't notice the mosaic at all, but nonetheless, I don't think that the weakness on Bill Clinton, listen, if you do the sustained attack on Clinton, and by the way, his wife, look, what they've decided to do here is fairly simple. There are not enough votes to elect George Bush president in his own right in America. There will not be between now and November, first Tuesday in November. I don't say that as a partisan. The fact is the country has moved beyond George Bush. Whether they're willing to go to Bill Clinton or not is still the issue. The Republican strategy has got to be to take what about 41 or 42% of the people that will be for George Bush and get 8 or 9% to go into the polls to vote squarely against Bill Clinton. They did that a little bit in '88, but the job is bigger now. I don't think they can do that. The trends are moving away from George Bush. Change in the country is serious. People want that kind of movement. They've done some damage to Clinton, but I think it's temporary damage, and I think they're flirting with a very dangerous strategy.
Is it?
But Bob, don't you think, I mean, you talk about a sustained attack. I mean, a sustained attack over just 4 days? I mean, come on, the guy loses 15 points in the polls for a 4-day attack?
Neil, I don't know where you were the last 60 days, pal, but I'm starting with Mary Matalin and going on down. This attack has been unrelenting on Bill Clinton and on his wife, which I think, frankly, Marilyn Quayle and Pat Buchanan both must have the same speechwriters, but if you listen to those two speeches these last several nights, that's the most vicious I've seen. I've been to a lot of conventions.
Roger Stone, how much can the Republicans help? Can they help themselves over the top with a largely negative campaign?
Well, I think a confrontational and comparative campaign, yes. I mean, all this whining about negative campaign tactics is the same Bill Clinton who savaged and, in my view, smeared Paul Tsongas in the Florida primary on Israel, on Social Security. The same Hillary Clinton who questioned George Bush's marital fidelity in Vanity Fair magazine. I mean, these hands are not clean. James Carville's the master of negative campaigning. Now suddenly saying, oh, these horrible Republicans are smearing us. They have to run a tough, confrontational, ideological campaign on taxes, on crime, on a number of issues.
But you said yourself a moment ago only half the job has been done.
Well, that's because Bush has not had his say yet. When I say that, what I mean is you've only seen part of this convention. The convention's not over yet, and the centerpiece is the president's acceptance speech.
Wendy Sherman, are we just hearing whining out of Little Rock, as both Mary Matalin and now Roger Stone are saying?
Oh, I don't think there's been so much whining. I think Bill Clinton's kept trying to get back to the message. In many ways, I think George Bush is really the big whine, which is to say it's everybody's fault but mine. It makes him into an impotent kind of president. I'm not sure that's what the American people want. And as we look at his speech tonight, he's tried to set up this convention as around an issue of trust. You should trust me, you shouldn't trust Bill Clinton. But he's got a tough role tonight because he can't make promises, because he's made promises in the past and broken every one of them. He promised there would be no new taxes, and indeed he raised taxes. He promised to create 30 million jobs. He's only created 1 million jobs. He promised to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and we all know where that stands. So if we're going to talk about trust and we're going to talk about performance, he has to be measured up by those standards as well. And I think he's got a very tough job to do that in this speech tonight.
Neil Newhouse.
Well, let's go back for a second to Bill Clinton and his whining. I mean, he is decrying this negative campaign and the slams he's supposedly taking from the Bush campaign and from this convention, whereas he laid down the gauntlet in his acceptance speech at his convention. I mean, he says, George Bush, if you won't use your power to help people, step aside, I will. Well, George Bush will tell people tonight how he's going to use his power. He says George Bush talks a good game, but he has no game plan. But I mean, this is not one-sided. The gauntlet was laid down, and George Bush is clearly going to pick it up tonight and take the campaign right to Bill Clinton.
Well, I was just going to say, and then I'll come to you, Bob. As Charlene was asking Mary Madeline this just a moment ago, what is it that the president is going to be asking people to do? What is the unifying theme? And she said to re-elect George Bush. Does there have to be more than that? How much more does that have to be fleshed out, Roger?
I think what the president's got to do is give an uplifting, visionary speech in which, as Mary put it, he tells us where he wants to take the country. And he also contrasts the alternative path. There is an alternative path before the American people. Now, Governor Clinton's done a very good job, I think, of trying to act a bit more moderate than his record or his proposals or his platform or his economic proposal, in fact, are. And part of our job is to get people to see what the real contrast here is, what the real choice is.
George Bush, let's go back to the history of George Bush. He has never been a good defensive candidate. In 1988, he had the advantage to be on the offensive. He didn't have to defend a record. All he had to do was, in good times, say Ronald Reagan did a good job. The people agree with that. He will be on the defensive. He will not play well on the defensive. Jim Baker does not know how to manage on the defensive. All this talk about this miracle man coming in, this miracle man can't undo 4 years of a bad economy. And that is what's going to bring George Bush down. Nothing else. They can be as negative as they want. People making $25,000 to $50,000 are persuadable voters in this country. They will decide this election. They're hurting. That won't change between now and November.
Roger. But Bob, wait a second, Bob. The voters have got to trust Bill Clinton. And that's what this election is all about. When the voters go in the voting booth on Election Day, it's a matter of who do they trust to run the country.
You know, Neil, I've been hearing that all year long. That's a pretty subtle message, isn't it, pal?
Not hardly.
Well, I think if we're going to talk about trust, then Bill Clinton's going to win, because as I said, every time the president has said, trust me, he hasn't lived up to that trust. And I think when we have that lovely scene last night of Barbara Bush on stage with all the children, which made us all feel wonderful and good about our families and want to go home and tuck our kids in bed and make sure everyone was safe and feel good about ourselves. George Bush may be a very good father, but to kids out there whose parents have lost their jobs, it really doesn't matter very much. And with unemployment, I think he has a very, very tough record to defend. I think Bob's made a very important point, and I don't know how he goes forward when his performance has been so bad.
Roger, can you address that point that Wendy Sherman's making? We lost a little of your audio, but we got the gist of it. And the point she made earlier, that it's not enough for the president to make a bunch of promises, given what happened after 1988.
I think that misunderstands the voters' view of George Bush. First of all, they like him, they trust him, and they know his judgment is sound. They do think that he should do more on the domestic side. They do recognize that he's extremely accomplished on the foreign policy side. The president can persuade the country, use that trust to persuade the country that he will now focus on a domestic agenda with the same gravity, with the same force, with the same aggressiveness he has on the foreign policy side, and
play he can do it here in late August.
I think he can do that because they know and they trust George Bush and they like him, but they don't think he's done quite enough. Here's an opportunity to convince them that he will.
Wendy Sherman?
I think it will be a very tough job to do, because the economy is not only not growing and not getting better, it is in fact getting worse, and we may have a third dip in this recession. I think that he's going to have to defend his past performance. I think that it is not enough to say, a la Truman, that it's Congress's fault. People are not happy with Congress, but that should not let the president off the hook.
Neil, excuse me, I just want, I want to get back to Neil because we're running out of time. Neil Newhouse, how much of a bounce in the polls does the president need to get to fortify himself for the fall campaign? Can you quantify it?
I don't think we ever dreamed we'd be 30 points down going into the convention, but if we're in low double digits, I think that's a comfortable margin for George Bush right now, considering that he has just got his campaign off the ground. And I think as time goes by...
You mean double digits separating them? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly right, double digits separating. I mean, a 10 to 15 point margin is certainly doable, and I think that if we're in that range, and George Bush, certainly we've got a tough campaign ahead of us, but that's easy striking distance for this campaign.
Do you agree with that, Bob?
No, first of all, I don't see where the 10 points are George Bush makes up. This will be, in my view, a close race. It will be decided by 2 or 3 debates. If Bill Clinton can do well in those debates, cross the threshold of credibility, that is to say people see him as a president, much like Ronald Reagan had to do in 1980, Clinton will win this race by 4 or 5 points. There just are not enough points for George Bush out there to get affirmatively to elect George Bush president again.
But just in terms of coming out of this convention, do you accept the notion that as long as he narrows it to 10 to 15?
No, it's going to be 8 or 9. It's not below double digits, but that 8 or 9, a long 8 or 9 between there and getting even with Bill Clinton. He won't do it.
Roger Stone.
I think 8 or 9 nationally.
Sorry, Wendy, we missed the first part of what you said.
I said they're not just 8 or 9 nationally. He has to go out and win states. It's not going to be 8 or 9 points in California. It's not necessarily going to be 8 and 9 points in Michigan, in states that he has to win. So you have to not only look at the overall polling results, you have to look at where he's going to win the states that he's doing so miserably in because the economies are so bad.
This race is going to be a horse race at the end. It's going to be very much like the Ford and Carter race. George Bush is going to make a lot of ground in the close. We've already seen states like Ohio and New Jersey closing to around 10 points. I think you're going to see a photo finish.
But bottom line, is the Bush campaign going to get what it needs out of this convention?
Yes, I think what this convention does is get us to about that 10, 11 point margin where victory is within grasp, and then they close by Election Day. You got to go to debates. The expectation level for Bush will be low. The expectation for the glib boy orator from Arkansas will be high, and we shall see.
That's wishful thinking, friend.
All right, well, thank you all for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charlayne?
Still ahead, the Vice President's home state boosters and a conversation with Marilyn Quayle. We turn now to the other half of the Republican ticket, Vice President Dan Quayle. 4 years ago, he was a not too well-known senator from Indiana when President Bush chose him to be his running mate. Tonight, he will be addressing the convention as a familiar face who, according to his advisors, needs to give people a better sense of who he is and what he believes in. Out in the hall will be a group of people who say they've known all along who he is. Correspondent KWAME Holman reports.
Republicans in the Astrodome will be hard-pressed to match the enthusiastic welcome Indiana delegates gave Dan Quayle yesterday at their Houston hotel. They helped elect their fellow Hoosier to 2 terms in the House of Representatives and 2 terms in the Senate.
We Hoosiers know the real Dan Quayle.
And these Hoosiers have stood solidly behind him during 4 turbulent years as Vice President.
Mr. Vice President, you and you alone are responsible for this group not having to stay at the Roadway Inn at the end. At the end of the runway at the airport, as we did 4 years ago.
At the convention 4 years ago, Indiana delegates were stranded at a hotel next to New Orleans International Airport, but not even the noise of passing jets could drown out their excitement. Convention week began with then-Senator Dan Quayle considered only a dark horse candidate for a spot on the ticket with George Bush. Quayle remained cool and non-committal.
George Bush knows what I'll bring to the ticket, and if that's what he needs on the ticket, so be it. If he wants to go with somebody else, so be it. I'll live with the decision to be on the ticket, and I'll live with the decision of not being on the ticket.
Quayle's selection as George Bush's running mate came on Tuesday of Convention Week 1988. The choice surprised most of the delegates in New Orleans, but it didn't surprise the delegates from Indiana, who exploded when the announcement was made.
I've died and gone to heaven. I mean, what more could we ask for?
My heart is pounding. I am very happy. I had no qualms. There never was a race. I knew it.
He has the temperament, he has the experience, he has the ability, and he has the talent to be a great president if that should ever come about. This group here is going to float right out of New Orleans come Friday. It's great. I love it. I love it.
But the Indiana delegation didn't float out of New Orleans. First, there were allegations Quayle had had an affair with a former lobbyist and model for Playboy magazine. Then came allegations that Quayle had dodged service in Vietnam by joining the Indiana National Guard, and that he had used his family's influence to get into the Guard. Rumors began to circulate that Quayle would be dumped from the ticket.
Dan Quayle is what we need right now, and if for some ugly reason like this, unfounded or unanswered, for someone to just dump the right man from our government, it's the most grave mistake we'll make.
Instead of enjoying the celebrity status of their native son, members of the Indiana delegation spent the rest of convention week trying to disprove the allegations against Dan Quayle and downplaying their importance.
It's going to take time to undo some of the things that the media did to him down here, but it'll be overcome rather quickly.
But during his 4 years as vice president, Dan Quayle has never been able to escape the close scrutiny and the criticisms. He's become so accustomed to the jokes that at this convention, he's telling them himself.
Now, friends, Bill Clinton was in my home state a few weeks ago, and he didn't like the fact that I had called him a liberal. As a matter of fact, he challenged me to spell the word liberal. Well, I can spell liberal. C-L-I-N-T-O-N-E.
Addressing his home state delegates yesterday, Vice President Quayle said it was their support that had helped him endure 4 tough years.
You've always been with me. You have stood with me, whether they've been good times or bad times. I prefer the good times. Politically speaking, you have been everything to our family. You have supported us from 1976 to this very day. And I just wanted to thank you for support.
In 4 years, the delegation's feelings for Dan Quayle have only grown fonder.
A very honest man. And I think he's for the country and for the public and for the good things of what makes families strong. Intelligent, enthusiastic, articulate.
Integrity, much as anything else.
Courageous. Very courageous.
He's a good hometown boy with good family values. We're proud to have him.
Has he been criticized where he deserves it or overly criticized?
Well, obviously, you guys followed us around 4 years ago. You saw it from the beginning, the things that were totally untrue about his wealth, about his military record. He served on active duty in the military. And obviously, Bill Clinton hasn't, and that's not been much of a record, but much of a controversy, as it was with Quayle. So it was a very unfair beginning.
Ilza Cook is not a delegate to this year's Republican convention, but her son Eric is. Eric, in looking at the story from 4 years ago, your mother seemed particularly upset about the coverage right after the announcement of Mr. Quayle's vice presidential nomination. How do you feel looking back on 4 years ago?
Well, I think it may have been a little prophetic. I think she might have been able to sense the vehemence which certain segments of the national media seemed to hold against Dan Quayle and how they were going to go after him. So a very interesting instinct that over the last 4 years we've really seen that happen. And I think she was right.
How has Dan Quayle done over these last 4 years?
I think he's had just a superb record. I think if you actually look at his accomplishments, you can hold those accomplishments up to any vice president who's ever served this country. He's had excellent leadership of the space agency. He's done a superb job with the Competitiveness Council. It's controversial among some people, but I can tell you that means that he must be getting a lot accomplished, getting regulations out of the way so business and people can thrive without excess of government rules and regulations. In addition to that, he has been one of the best people around the country raising money for candidates. Just done a superb job.
Indiana loves Dan Quayle. We like him personally, and we like his politics.
And we're not only defensive for him personally, but maybe it's also a little bit that we're defensive for ourselves. And it's a little bit of a slam against the people of Indiana because, in effect, outsiders are telling us we're not smart enough to choose our candidate.
Will the real Dick Lugar stand up?
Indiana delegates are determined to have fun at this year's convention, even if it's at the expense of their senior senator. And they cheered wildly when Marilyn Quayle spoke from the podium.
With Dan Quayle at his side, our president will continue to steer a steady course for this nation and will lead this world to a brighter tomorrow.
For the Indiana delegation, this convention has been a more relaxing experience than New Orleans was 4 years ago. But none of the members underestimates the importance of the speech Vice President Dan Quayle will deliver tonight.
I want Dan Quayle to reintroduce himself to America on his terms so they know the real Dan Quayle. And I think when he does that, people around the country are going to see that this man is a natural leader. He represents the mainstream values of America, and he has a record of accomplishment that's second to none.
The great state of Indiana, the Hoosier state, home of Midwestern common sense, family values, and the proud home of the 44th Vice President of the United States, Dan Quayle, is proud to cast its 51 votes for President George Bush.
The delegates all head home tomorrow. President Bush and Vice President Quayle will go their separate ways to campaign. Bush to Missouri and Quayle to where his campaign began 4 years ago, back home again in Indiana.
When the vice president